I mean, all I'm saying is a sort of a series of...
Obviously, how a particular individual dies is going to be a very particular set of circumstances. What we've been trying to establish is that part of the story which explains why he didn't have proper body armour. I'm conscious of time, so I'll just ask one more question about personal equipment, and then I think probably be a good time for me to stop, although there are some other equipment issues to get into. And that's simply the question of protection against chemical and biological warfare. I mean, to the extent that you had intelligence that warned that Saddam might have had these stocks and might use them, were you concerned at the difficulties in getting the adequate equipment to the troops?
As I understood it, everybody was equipped with appropriate clothing to protect them, and indeed, one of the complaints I received was the fact that they every so often had to train to get into and out of these suits, and did so on a regular basis, even though in the end they did not have to wear them. We were very, very conscious of the threat, and people were trained and expected to use the clothing to protect. I think
one of the concerns was that a lot of the kit was out of date. You had kit, but it was out of date kit.
Well, I don't recall any suggestion that any of this kit was ineffective. I don't know whether...
Fortunately, it was never tested.
Well, I don't know whether there was a sell-by date on the kit, or there may well have been, but as far as I'm aware, whenever this was tested, this equipment was fit for its purpose. And
just Lord Boyce told us that, quote, I recall the biggest difficulty we had with these issues was actually our NBC protection. So,
well, I have to say I've not come across anything specific to suggest that NBC protection was not available to every soldier who needed it. And indeed, as I say, the most frequent complaint I received was a number of occasions on which they had to stop everything and get into this kit, which wasn't entirely a straightforward process. But nevertheless, they were made to do it, and it was part of the instruction that came down the chain of command.
I'm sorry, I don't want to go on about this, but this was also a point raised by the Committee on Public Accounts. Troops at the front line did not receive sufficient supplies of a range of important equipment, including enhanced combat body armour and nuclear, biological and chemical and detection and protection systems.
Well, that was not... I mean, I have seen, obviously, the criticism in relation to enhanced combat body armour. I'm not aware that there was serious criticism about a lack of protective clothing for those who needed it.
Well, I think I'll...
This is definitely time for a break, I think. We'll break for a quarter of an hour.
Thank you.
Come back then. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, we come to the final quarter of the day, and I'll ask Sir Roderick to pick up the questions from everyone.
I'd like to take a little break from equipment issues, though I dare say they may reappear, but to look at another very important issue, which was how the coalition handled the security sector from the time after the campaign had been completed until the time that you left your post as Secretary of State for Defence in 2005. So 2003 to 5. And this was obviously a period in which problems, quite serious problems, began to arise. If we go back near the beginning, after the campaign had finished, there was a brief ORHA period, and then ORHA was dismissed, and Mr. Jerry Bremer arrived at the head of the Coalition Provisional Authority with a British senior diplomat, first John Sawes, then Sir Jeremy Greenstock, working with him. Jeremy wasn't officially his number 2, as he explained. And Bremer finds that already the security situation is beginning to get fragile, that the governance is very fragile, insofar as it existed at all. And in his first week, he takes some very big decisions on things like debathification, which we've discussed with a number of other witnesses, and on disbanding the army. Now, the army had largely dissolved, but it hadn't been formally disbanded, and there is a question as to whether it was necessary to do so, or if you had actually offered pay to people who returned to their posts, vetted them, you couldn't have had an army to work with to deal with your security problems. What view did you take of these decisions by Bremer, which, as we've heard from Sir John Sawes, had been agreed in Washington before he arrived, and the impression I have, unless you wish to correct this, is that we had barely been consulted on them at all?
Well, I referred earlier to the paper that I gave to Donald Rumsfeld on a visit to the Pentagon in February, and implicit in that paper, certainly as far as de-Baathification was concerned, although the phrase doesn't appear, was that we wanted, I think we described them as Iraqi technocrats who may have gone along with the regime, to be available to continue to administer the system. As I understood it, belonging to the Ba'ath Party was a precondition of certain jobs in Saddam's Iraq. We thought, and the paper that I gave him emphasizes, that there would be people who had joined the Ba'ath Party because they wanted, for example, to be civil servants, not because they necessarily were enthusiastic supporters of Saddam Hussein. And we felt that there ought to be a distinction between those who were enthusiastic supporters of Saddam Hussein and those who simply joined the party in order to gain position. Not least because we anticipated some of the difficulties that ensued in administering Iraq in the aftermath. I think a similar argument arises in relation to the army. We, as I mentioned earlier, saw the army as a force for stability. We had not attacked it in certain places specifically in order to try and preserve its coherence, but as you rightly say, many of the people went home, but it could have been reconstituted relatively quickly. And I think some of the security difficulties, particularly in and around Baghdad, were the result of disaffected people no longer receiving their salary, joining the insurgency, and indeed putting their expertise to use, in the sense that there was clear suggestion to me that some of the attacks became more sophisticated as some military people became involved, or former military people, I should say.
So these decisions, not to put too fine a point on it, were mistakes?
I think they were. I think that it would have been better to have that stability in that immediate aftermath, and I think that to some extent disbanding the army fueled the insurgency in a way that made it much harder to contain. Having said that, and at some stage I did have a discussion about some of these issues, and I think the Americans were very focused on the fact that someone loyal to Saddam Hussein could not be entirely relied upon, and therefore they felt that a fresh start from scratch was a better way forward. I'm not saying the arguments are all one way.
No, but should we have been given more of a chance to participate in the debate, influence the decisions before they were taken and announced?
I'm sure in due course the inquiry will look at the paper that I submitted, and it demonstrates beyond doubt that those 2 points that I've said already were matters in our minds at the time.